Would you like to design your very own Spectator UI system using Verse inside of UEFN? Well, you're in the right place because I will teach you everything you need to know in this tutorial video. The code that I write will be available for completely free in my Discord server. You can join by following the very first link in the description. Alright, so the very first thing we want to do is open up the Verse Explorer on the right hand side here. It might show up on a different part of your editor, but if you ever want to rearrange it, you can just drag it by the top and move it around. And then go ahead and right click on the content folder here and create a new Verse file. We're going to name this Spectator Device. And then go ahead and click create. Alright, so now that we're inside of Visual Studio, I'm going to go ahead and clean up some of the comments left for us by Epic Games. So now that we've got it all cleaned up, the first thing we want to do is define a new variable. And this variable is going to be called Spectator Class. And it is going to be of type class and team selector device. And what this does is it allows us to manage what class the player is assigned to, which will come in handy later when we need to respawn them. The next thing that we need to do is define the respawn class. And this will also be a class and team selector device. And this is, again, just to make sure that when they do respawn, it's handled properly, because we need to limit the number of spawns that they have when they die. So the next variable we need to define is a little bit more complicated because we're going to be using two different coordinate spaces. So this variable is going to be called respawn location. And because we're using two different coordinate spaces, we need to define which one it's from. So this one is going to be from verse.org/spatial math. It's important you put a colon here at the end, and then just a close parenthesis with the word vector3. And then same thing again in parentheses /verse.org/spatial math. Colon, and then again just vector3. It will give you an error and it says unknown identifier vector3. Did you forget to specify one of the following? verse.org/spatialmath and unrealengine.com/temporary/spatialmath. We want both of these. So go ahead and copy both of them, go up to the very top where there's the modules and paste them in. So the next thing we need to define is the Z offset. It's important that we include the Z offset here because when the teleport is called, we would need to make sure that it's actually clear enough for the player to spawn in. If we spawn them in at the exact coordinate space, it usually will fail because the player is 72 centimeters tall. So this is here just to account for that. So no matter where you try to teleport them, as long as there's an open space, the teleport should pass. So this last variable is actually going to be optional. I'm just going to be using it for testing. There's going to be an elimination button. Feel free to follow along if you are setting this up in a blank project. I encourage you to test out the code yourself, but this button device will eliminate myself so that I can basically spectate whenever I need to. In your case, when you would implement this device, you would need to hook it up to the actual player elimination, which you could do easily by subscribing to the elimination event. The onBegin function is super easy. For me, all I need to do is just subscribe to the interacted with event for the button. And because this is a test button, I'm just going to link it to the function directly responsible for handling whether or not a player can become a spectator. So the next thing we want to do is define a new class called Spectator UI. This is going to be of type class. We're going to need to define a few variables inside of here. The first one being respawn class, and this is a class and team selector device. And the next one that we have is a respawn location, and this one is actually of type unrealengine.com/temporary/spatial math. This vector3 uses the XYZ coordinate, not the LUF. After that we have the Z offset, and this is just going to be a same thing as before, unrealengine.com/temporary spatial map. Below that we want to have the spectator canvas, and this is going to be the actual canvas widget that we display to the character. And it's important that these variables down here are instantiated, but these ones are not, because these variables up here are required for the class. So we wouldn't want this class to be created unless there are these variables passed into it. Below the spectator canvas we have the respawn button, and this is just going to be of type button quiet. Below that we have button text, and this is going to localize, and it's going to be of type message. and we can just do respawn. Now, inside of the Spectator UI, we're going to have 3 functions. The first one is add UI, and that just takes in an agent. For now, we can just close that off with parentheses. Below that, we have on button press, which takes in a widget message. And so I like to define that as widget data, just because it's easier for me to understand. Below that, we have make spectator canvas. This returns a canvas. And for that, we can just do canvas curly brackets so that it doesn't yell at us. Returning back to the add UI function, the first thing we want to do is define the player reference. So player ref is a cast call of agent. The player UI is get player UI, and then we need to pass that player into the get player UI. Boom, just like that. Below there, we have to set the spectator canvas equals make spectator canvas. Below that, we want to access the player UI, and we want to add the canvas widget to the UI. So spectator canvas. I can never spell spectator, man. It is like the most difficult word to spell. We have player UI slot dot input mode dot all. Basically what this does is it restricts any kind of input unless it regards the UI. So for example, when they're spectating, all of their controls will be focused on the respawn button. And lastly, inside of the add UI function, we need to do spectator canvas dot set visibility equals widget visibility dot visible. In the button press function, we're going to define the player reference again, except this time we need to access the message. So wdata.player is how you can access it. The player UI also needs to be defined. So get player UI, pass that in, just like that. We want to set the spectator canvas to widget visibility dot hidden. And then we want to access the UI again, and we want to remove the widget of the spectator canvas. Now, once we've removed the UI, we first need to make sure that in the respawn class that we change their class. And this default class here, or the one that's used to get, to respawn, it has unrestricted respawns, and that's part of why we can force the spectator to happen. Below that, we want to do player ref.respawn, and it's important that you call the respawn function on the player, not the agent. For whatever reason, if you try to respawn an agent, it causes like very unnoticeable errors, like very tiny things where like the collision is messed up, you can't shoot them, stuff like that. When I originally tried to figure out how this works, I couldn't get it. Big shout out to my buddy Anthony. He's actually the one who showed me that the player is what works with the respawn function. So for the location itself, we want to pass in the respawn location, and we want to apply the Z offset. After that, we need to define the rotation. And so a really easy workaround is we can do /unrealengine.com/temporary spatial math. Rather than passing in, like a predefined rotation or whatever, you can actually just do identity rotation. And you can call this identity rotation anytime you need to pass in a rotation. It can be a player, it can be an NPC, it could be a vehicle even. The identity rotation is a global function that will always work. I'm going to be really honest, I don't know how, I don't know why, but the identity rotation is a secure thing that you can always rely on if you need to pass in a rotation and you don't care about the specific degree that the player is facing. So now that we've finished the first 2 functions, we can go ahead and get started on the canvas itself. Before we actually draw the canvas, we need to make sure that the button is correctly set up. So first we want to do respawn button.setText, and then we want to pass in that message we defined earlier. We also want to subscribe to the clicked event, so we do respawn button.onClick.subscribe, and we want to link that back to the on button press. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and define a new spectator canvas, and this is going to be of type canvas. And if you've never made a UI in Verse before, it may seem pretty overwhelming because there's a lot of numbers and there's a lot of new words that don't really have any meaning. I'm going to walk you through this step by step on exactly how to set up a Verse UI. The first thing that you need to know about Verse UI is that every single widget inside of a canvas has a slot. And in fact, the canvas itself has different slots. And all of these slots, we just simply need to define them as an array. And inside of here, we can actually create, a new member of the canvas. So in this case, we'll do canvas slot. Below that, we need to do anchors, and this is going to be of type anchors with a minimum vector2 value of 0.5 and 0.5. The maximum vector2 value will also be 0.5 and the y 0.5. Below that, we have the offsets, which will be a margin, and the margin actually uses a different set of 1 2 3 4. It's left, and for right now we can do 0.0, top 0.0, right, and bottom. And the thing about margins is you can think of it very simply like this: left, top, right, bottom. The left is the X offset, so this is the horizontal positioning of the widget. The top offset is the Y position. But you're probably asking yourself, there's still two more values. What is the right and the bottom if it's the X and the Y? The right actually describes the horizontal width of the widget itself, the size of the widget. And the bottom offset is really just the vertical measurement of the widget itself. So instead of saying left, top, right, bottom, you can think of it as X, Y, width, height. After that, we can get into the alignment, which is a vector2. The X is going to be 0.5 and the Y is going to be 0.0. Below that, we need to do size to content, and we want to set this as true. And finally, inside of the canvas slot, we can go ahead and define the widget, which is actually just going to be an overlay. Inside of this overlay, it is a very similar structure. So each widget has a bunch of slots inside of it. So if you could imagine the canvas, we inserted an overlay into that slot. Now, the overlay also has a bunch of slots inside of it. So whatever you put inside of the overlay or inside of a widget will inherit all of the qualities and the position of the canvas slot. So we want to do slots equals array, and inside of that overlay, we want to have an overlay slot. We don't need to have any padding or anything like that, so we can just define the widget as the respawn button. One final touch that we need to make is we need to set the vertical offset to 350. And finally, at the bottom, we can just delete this canvas, because whatever value is at the very end of a function will always be returned inside of a function that has an output. So in this case, I have a very simple example function just to demonstrate what I'm talking about. Right here, normally what you would see inside of your code is this line here, return integer. And this is just an example variable that I have. But what you can do is, instead of specifying return integer, it's actually redundant. So you can go ahead and you can just define the integer all by itself. And then this function, whatever the result is, it will return that result. So the next part of the video, we're going to be designing a conversion function, and it's a little bit hard to understand, but I want to try my best to explain it in a way that makes sense. On one hand, we have the Unreal Engine coordinate space, which uses X, Y, and Z. And this is probably what you're familiar with. It's what Fortnite has used for the past couple years. But recently, and I think this was in 36.0 or maybe 35, they came out with an update where they included a new coordinate space called LUF. And that stands for left, up, front. It is the exact same idea as XYZ, except they decided to change it, and I don't really know why they decided to do this, but it has been an extremely massive headache trying to decide all this. So with all that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and type out a function, and then I want you to follow along and copy me as I'm typing it out. But I'm going to explain how it works after I finish writing it, so I can go piece by piece and explain how it works. So we're going to start with 2xyz, and this is going to take in a LUF vector. That's just the variable name. But remember, because we're using both coordinate spaces, we have to define it. So what I would honestly recommend doing is I'm going to comment this out, and up here, I'm going to add 2 lines with a comment. And on the first line, I'm going to write verse LUF vector. And then I'm going to paste the vector 3 just like that. So whenever I need the verse LUF vector, I can just copy it. And similarly, I want to grab the Unreal Engine as well and do UEXYZ vector. And same thing, I'm going to paste that and type vector3. So now as I write this function, I can just copy paste it. So going back to the XYZ function, we can paste the verse spatial math vector inside of there. And this is going to return a Unreal Engine vector. So paste that in, and then don't forget the equal sign. And now what we want to do is, so we want to define an XYZ vector, except we need to rearrange the values. And I'll explain what I mean in a second. So we're going to do XYZ vector, and this is of type Unreal Engine vector3. And for this, we want to define the X, the Y, and the Z, just like that. I forgot the T right here. So before I took the time to write a dedicated function for converting the vectors, I wrote this little graphic here that explains how everything works. So the X is negative Y, so you have to flip it. So the X value right here, this becomes the LUF vector dot forward. The Y value, this used to be X, we need to invert it with the negative sign, and then we need to do LUF vector dot right, or excuse me, I'm so sorry, this is actually supposed to be left right here. And the final one that we need to do is LUF vector dot up. And the reason why this is so important we do this is because of the fact that when you're, quickly rearranging the map and stuff, if you ever want to look back on this code and change it, all you need to do is just type in the transform values as exactly as you see them in the editor, and this function will automatically convert it to the appropriate vector used to teleport. So without further ado, now that we have the UI set up and we have the conversion function set up, we can dig right into the meat and potatoes of the actual Spectator device. The first thing we want to do is you want to define all the players inside of the game. So to do this, we do get player, or excuse me, we do get play space, get players, and then below that we need to have an if statement that defines some failable variables. So the first one is we're going to define the player ref again, and this is going to be a cast from the agent. The next thing we need to do is we need to define the player UI. Same as before, do get player UI and then pass the player in. After that, we need to define the fort character because we need to eliminate them. And to do that, we do player ref.get fort character. And finally, we just need to check to see if the fort character is active. And it's important that you check that the fort character is active, not that the player is active. If you check that the player is active, all it says is whether or not they are connected to a session. If you check to see if the fort character is active, that will tell you whether or not the player is alive or not. So, assuming that the player can be defined and assuming that that player is alive, we now need to define the total amount of life that they have. So this total life function is going to be fort character dot get max health plus fort character dot get max shield. And then below that, we want to make sure we set them to the Spectator class. So change class, and then we want to pass in the player reference, just like that. There's a little typo here. And then we want to eliminate the player. So we do fort character dot damage, and then we do total life times 2. And the thing is with the damaging function, you don't need to deal double their health, but I'd just like to do it in case there's any healing happening, or maybe like a fraction of a second they get healed. This is just to ensure that no matter what happens, they will get eliminated. Below that, we do the new Spectator UI. So we want to define a new instance of the UI class that we created. And this is going to be Spectator UI. Remember, we need to instantiate the variables in order to create the instance, because we didn't do it in the class itself. We need to pass them in here. So the first thing is the respawn class is just going to be equal to respawn class. And remember, this respawn class here belongs to the instance, and this respawn class here is the editable variable that we defined at the beginning of the video. The next thing we need to do is the respawn location, and this is actually going to be xyz vector is equal to 2xyz, and this is the respawn location. So this is us passing in the respawn location. And then finally, we need to apply the z offset. And remember, I said that we were going to convert it automatically. So the z offset is going to be the, I'm going to copy this down here. So we got the Unreal Engine vector, and the x value is 0, the y value is also 0, but the z is going to be equal to the z offset. There was a little error here. For whatever reason, I'm having a really hard time typing today, so apologies for all of my misspellings. And then now, once we've defined the UI, we want to go ahead and do a new Spectator UI, and then we want to add that to the UI with the agent. So now that we've defined a new instance, we want to call that instance new Spectator UI, and then we want to call the add UI function inside of the agent. Also, one quick thing, on line 72, the player UI, we can actually delete this because we didn't end up using the player UI like I thought we would, because we ended up just defining that inside of the function itself. And just for debugging purposes, I'm going to add an else statement that says print failed to enter spectate mode. There we go. Okay, so now that we're done with the coding part, go ahead and build verse code. And once the verse code has been built, we can go ahead and drag the spectator device out into the level. So now that you finish writing the script, I'm going to walk you through how to set up the devices and what settings to put for all of them. The first thing we're going to search for is a class selector device. Go ahead and drag that into the play space. It's also important that we rename this to class selector default. And if you already have a project that uses class selectors, you can completely skip this step and you can link the default class selector. In this case, I am setting it up just for testing purposes, so I'm going to do class to switch to, class slot 1. The color is going to be white, just so I know that it's a default. Go ahead and duplicate this by holding Alt and dragging the gizmo. I'm going to change the class slot to 2, and I'm going to reset the accent color back to blue. I'm also going to go in my outliner and rename this to class selector spectator. The next thing we're going to search for is a class designer. Go ahead and drag that in. We only need one class designer, so this class identifier is going to be class 2. Go ahead and type in spawn and set the spawn limit to 1. In total, your device settings should look like this. Go ahead and take a minute to pause and double check that your settings are correct. Inside of the island settings, you can scroll all the way to the bottom and you can enable debug. You want to make sure that the test players on start is set to custom and the number of test players is set to 1. This is again just for testing purposes, for the purpose of learning and figuring out how everything works. If you are actually going to implement this into your own game, you wouldn't need to have any test players. It will automatically register to any players. If your game involves multiple teams, but it's not necessarily a PvP aspect, I would highly recommend allow spectating other teams. For example, inside of Murder Mystery, if you get eliminated early, you can still spectate the rest of the match, even if you're not on the same team as the other survivors. So here's what your island settings should look like if you've been following along with the video. If everything looks good, go ahead and click on the creative device. Go over to the spectator class, link that one, go over to the respawn class, which is the default class, by the way. And the respawn location itself is just set to 000. Yeah, so I'm actually going to move this back a little bit because the teleport will fail. Just the 000 is fine because that is this point right here. And remember, we have the Z offset, so it should automatically handle correctly. And of course, we can't forget about the elimination button. There we go, drag that into the scene, go back to the creative device. There are no settings that need to be changed on that. This is just for testing, and then click the link button. Here's what the device bindings will look like once you set them up correctly. Once everything looks good, start up a session. Alright, so now that we're in game, we can see our nice friend here, George, and with the click of a button, we will become spectators. And you can see here that it automatically snaps to an available player, so in this case, the only player is George. I also have the option of this respawn button right here. I can't click anything, Players can still absolutely leave the game if they decide to do so, but more importantly, if they want to respawn, they can. With all that out of the way, I really just wanted to say thank you. If you're watching this right now and you made it all the way to the very end, your support genuinely does mean a lot. I'm planning on creating at least 3 to 4 videos a month, and if you want to stay up to date with everything I've got going on, get access to free scripts, access to free content, everything will be available inside of the Discord server. Other than that, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Peace.